So I'm extremely honoured to be here today. When I was nominated, I was sent a booklet of people who'd done these lectures, and quite frankly, it was incredibly intimidating. But I've steeled myself, and here I am to speak to you, and it's absolutely wonderful to see everyone. It's a huge honour to be here. I want to say a few thank yous, particularly to the University of Melbourne for hosting me, to Jane and Nick for nominating me for this award, and the joint nature of this nomination is just really enriching for me and my research, and I've already had some absolutely fantastic conversations with students and academics, and I've only been here a week, so there's lots more to come. Angela's been amazing organising everything and telling me where I need to be and when, so thank you for that, and Gemma Cakeley has been incredible in the organisation. I also have a lot to thank Australia for. Not least, I'm married to an Australian. So this is our first day in Australia. Does anyone know where that is? It's the G. So, first day, we went to see Richmond. And you can see we're all very excited about it. Not a clue what's going on, but it's very exciting. Second day in Australia. Half of the Richmond shop bought up, fully fledged, signed up members. So I'm extremely grateful. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to start off talking about some of the research that we do in our group. So we have diverse interests. We're broadly interested in the psychosocial factors that underpin self-harmful and suicidal behaviour. And we go across the lifespan, but we particularly focus on young people. And increasingly, we work side by side in a way that means that we're co-creating knowledge with young people in various different ways that I'll tell you about as we go through. I'm going to say something about time and complexity, which we feel have been kind of underrepresented in the literature and really need some further explanation and research. Then I'm going to think about what helps young people who self-harm. So we're really interested in the journey of self-harm, what gets people started with self-harm, what keeps them self-harming once they are self-harming, what might help them to stop or self-harm less frequently or alleviate the psychological distress that underpins self-harm. And then I'm going to say a little bit about the future and where we're going with all of that. So before I really get stuck into things, I want to say a tiny point about language, because small changes can have a really big impact. So this is one of my PhD students, Emma Nielsen, who is absolutely wonderful, about to finish her PhD thesis, where she's been looking at the functional dynamics of coping in self-harm, actually across the lifespan. And she wrote this absolutely brilliant blog, Mind Your C's and S's, why the language of self-harm matters. So we say, died by suicide instead of committed suicide. Suicide has not been a crime in Australia since 1958, nor in the UK since 1961. And rather than saying self-harmer or self-cutter, we say person who self-harms. So they're small changes, but they can have a really big impact. So I invite you to read Emma's blog. It's excellent. Also, excellent blog for the APA in Australia by Susan Beaton and colleagues. And Mindframed also have a really excellent guide for the media, how to talk about self-harm and suicidality. Okay, when I say self-harm, what do I mean? I mean any act of intentional self-poisoning or self-injury, regardless of suicidal intent or the apparent motivation of the act. So that we're taking a really broad continuum, a really broad perspective of self-harmful behaviour. So here's some data from the multi-centre study that Jane was talking about, which is a collaboration between 3 centres, 6 hospitals collecting data, really high-quality data on people who come into hospital having self-harmed. And what I want you to notice is this huge, steep rise in the late teenage years. We see this really big increase in presentations to hospital over those years. Now, that mirrors an increase in suicide too. So recent data from the National Confidential Inquiry in the UK show us that in the late teenage years we see this really big rise in suicide as well. In terms of the stats in Australia, some recent data suggests that at least 1 in 10 teenagers have ever self-harmed, and around a quarter of 16 to 17-year-old girls. And one thing to say about this is it's the tip of the iceberg. We know that there are many more episodes of self-harm that never come to the attention of clinical services, that never present to primary care or accident and emergency. So it is the tip of the iceberg. And in our work, what we're trying to do is get underneath that iceberg a little bit. And I know that there's great work happening here at the university to do that too. Now, a really important point to make is this. About half of young people who die by suicide have previously self-harmed. Okay, so again, this is data from Manchester, the National Confidential Inquiry for Suicide and Homicide. So focusing on people who self-harm is a really vital ingredient for suicide prevention. It's a real opportunity, a moment to intervene and make a difference in anyone's life, and tonight I'm talking about young people in particular. And we've got to the situation where suicide is actually now the leading cause of death in those aged 5 to 19 in the UK and 5 to 17 in Australia. Okay, so this is a big problem and it needs big thinking to solve some of these issues. So here's a bit of a complex diagram. And I have two reasons for showing you this. One is to show you the kind of multi-dimensional kind of complexity of what is underpinning these kinds of behaviours. So we have factors that might have happened in the past, genetic, biological factors. People might have a psychiatric disorder, may have personality issues, they might be experiencing psychological distress. They may know someone who has self-harmed or who has died by suicide. And if the method to do something is available, the outcome could be suicide or self-harm. So on the one hand, this might be like, well, where do we start, Ellen? There's so much going on here. The other way to think about this is a map of opportunities. Here we have many places that we can intervene and make a difference. We know that we have a raft of psychological talking therapies that can make a difference to things like psychological distress and hopelessness and impulsivity and so on. So it's thinking about the lots of different ways that we could work to improve things for young people. So thinking about that complexity, what we've tended to do in the literature is one or two things. One is to simplify, focus on a couple of things and do them really well, or target high-risk groups. In our group, we've done a bit of both. So here's Sarah Knowles, who was a PhD student with me and is now a successful mental health research fellow at the University of Manchester. And she did some really exciting work with young offenders. And she was interested to see what were the predictors of self-harm in a group of community-based young offenders. And she managed to recruit 56. Now, it's a small sample, but for this group, this is a heroic achievement. And most supervisions were spent problem-solving. How can we reach young people? How can we get to invite young people to take part in this research? Because we face a lot of barriers from people who were looking after these young people, the gatekeepers, if you like. And that's quite a common theme in our research, that they perceive it to be too risky for the young person to talk about how they're feeling, so actually we're not allowed to speak to them. So this is a kind of leitmotif problem throughout our research. But what she did find is that the things that predicted self-harm status were psychological in nature. So we looked at a bunch of psychological and social factors, but actually When we looked at them together in a big multivariate model, so we can pit the different variables against each other to see which is the most important in leading to someone self-harming, it was self-esteem that made the difference to these young people. So that's great. But big methodological problem is it's cross-sectional. So really what we want to do is to measure a number of time points so that we can see whether things that we've measured at baseline change over time, so we can say something about the directionality of the effects, which we can't do at all here. So we did this in another high-risk group, young people who have been treated in child and adolescent mental health services for self-harm. And this is Katie Glazebrook, who was a PhD student, now a successful clinical psychologist in the UK. And she was really keen to look at attachment, and still to this day works with mothers and babies, actually, in her clinical practice. And she did this lovely longitudinal study. She recruited 52 young people. She followed them up 6 months later, having established their attachment status, insecure or secure, and then to see whether or not that had an impact on whether they self-harmed at time to 6 months later. Now, she managed to have a follow-up rate of 94%, so she was amazing at keeping in touch with these young people, keeping them engaged with the study, so with this incredible follow-up rate. And what this graph shows us is that having a secure attachment is protective. You're less likely to repeat self-harm if you're securely attached to your maternal caregiver and also to your peers. So there's something protective about that attachment and that social environment. And that was over and above other things that we know normally are strong predictors for future self-harm, like depression, like anxiety, and levels of self-harm. But again, small numbers. So it's all well and good. Attachment looks important, but there's probably a ton of other things that we ought to be measuring to see how attachment compares to other really important psychosocial constructs. So more recently, we've been working with looked after young people. So looked after young people are living outside the family home, not with their biological parents, either in a care home or in foster care. And there's been very, very little research on this group, interestingly, even though they're very high risk of self-harmful and suicidal behaviours. And we did 3 studies in a project we received funding from the Department of Health in England to do, and I'm going to tell you a bit about a few of them tonight. So one of the things that we did was an audio-computer assisted self-interview. And we've used these quite a lot in our research. We like them because young people listen to questions on the computer over headphones. They can click their response privately, so it's good for getting disclosure to sensitive topics. So we get very good criterion validity so that we know that if someone might talk about something that they've done that might be illegal, if we went to look at their criminal record, we'd be likely to find a match between what we were finding and what they're reporting to us. Also, it overcomes problems with literacy. So many of the groups that we work with are very vulnerable, they've had limited education opportunities, and they really struggle with reading. So hearing things over headphones and being able to click a mouse response means that we don't have to exclude people that can't read. So in this particular study, we worked very closely with an advisory group of young people who were with us right before we got the funding, actually. And they helped shape how this research project should look all the way through. And this is the result of one of the early meetings that we had talking about, what should the priorities be for this research? So we know from risk factors research, from models in the area, from our clinical experience, that the things that we think we should be focusing on, but what, from your experience, do you think we ought to be looking at? And they were really inventive, and they came up with things that we hadn't really thought of in a number of ways. So one of them was to do with the notion of consistency and inconsistency, particularly for looked after young people. And we got that in terms of they might have had a number of living placements, so several foster parents or living in several different care homes. But we hadn't thought necessarily about school placements. And our young people said, well, you've got to ask about school because it's really difficult, the transition to a different school. You know, it's really terrifying, it's really difficult, so make sure you do that. So we were able to add some things in about schools and so on. So we have 125 people, 26 people that we recruited to this study. 53 of them have been looked after. So again, a really difficult group to access. And this research took place at a time when the child sexual exploitation scandal blew up in the UK, which kind of emerged in Rotherham. So social workers were even more terrified than usual of asking young people to do anything that was remotely possibly risky. So we had a real kind of uphill battle to get young people into this study. But the researchers working on the project were absolutely determined that those young people were going to have their voices heard, and they were dogged. They did not give up. And I felt sorry for some of the social workers by the end of it because they wouldn't let it lie. So I'm going to share with you just a sort of taster of the data from the baseline. So we've measured a variety of psychosocial factors at baseline in young people. So they're aged 11 to 21. They're quite young, mean age of 16. Not many males. This is fairly typical of research in this area and reflects to some degree the fact that more young women than young men self-harm. However, that ratio is getting less marked. So the thing to notice here is really high levels of both depression and anxiety in these young people. Now, they're recruited through clinical services, through social services, and through the community. And actually, we've got most of our young people through the community. So we're not talking about a clinical sample per se, but yet we're seeing really high levels of depression and anxiety. We also wanted to look at suicidal intent, which is to some degree a bit of a hot topic in our field at the moment. And we asked young people to tell us how they felt on the basis of their most recent episode of self-harm on a scale of 1 to 8. Did they want to live or did they want to die? So if I ask you to look at this graph and just focus in on the green bars, so you can see we've got the most frequent response here. This is what most young people said. Now, just quietly to yourselves, I won't ask you to shout out because it's a big lecture theatre. I would like you to think what these anchors might be for this scale. Okay? So one of them is I wanted to live, and one of them is I wanted to die. So we're asking young people to make a rating of how they felt. Okay. Was that the direction you thought it might be in? So often people are surprised when I show them this. That, you know, we've got the majority of young people saying, actually, on the basis of my last episode, I really wanted to die at that point. And we asked it in a slightly different way as well. We asked a forced choice question later on. Did you want to live? Did you want to die? And it still comes out in the same direction. Okay? So obviously these are baseline data, and what we want to see is what are the factors which over time are protective in terms of reducing self-harm or promoting recovery from self-harm. So hopefully once we've crunched the data, we'll be able to report on those in the future. We've still got quite small numbers, and this is what we find, particularly if we're looking to work with what we might call, in quotes, particularly vulnerable groups, where there are gatekeepers that we need to go through to access. So a situation where we have lots and lots of data is the multi-centre study. So here we have thousands of patients who've come into the emergency department for self-harm in Oxford, Manchester or Derby. And So it's a really rich data set in the sense we have lots of people. And we did a paper a while ago looking at, what were the life problems that people come into hospital for and report were perhaps the final straw, the thing that sort of tipped them over into what influenced them to self-harm. And interestingly, for both older people and younger people, relationships are the number one thing that they talk about. For older people, it's partners, romantic partners. For younger people, it's family relationships and other relationships and dealing with the consequences of abuse. So in the future, we'll be able to look at how these things change over time, which is something that we're working at the moment. So is it that young people's problems change if they carry on with self-harm, or do they change and evolve over time? So whilst it's a really nice, rich data set in terms of the numbers, because it's administered in a clinical setting which is very pressured and very time sensitive, we're limited in the amount of data that we can collect. So although we have a lot of it, it's impoverished in some ways. So we always have a bit of a trade-off. Do we do detail with a few people, or do we do lots of information, less information with lots of people? So I think hopefully what I've given you is a flavour of this being a very complex issue. And often what the media would like you to believe that this is very simple, it's down to a couple of things. But actually what I want to try and convince you of tonight is this very complicated and multidimensional, and we need to embrace that in future research and in designing supports and services for young people. So the bubbles here just show some of the things that we found in our research and other people have found in their research to be important in self-harm. The green bubbles are things that are also overlapping with young people who've died by suicide. We have a few problems in our research area, and this rather depressing paper came out recently, Joseph Franklin and his team in the States in Psychological Bulletin, who told us, having reviewed the literature for the past 50 years, we've done no better in predicting suicidal thoughts and behaviours. And that's for a number of reasons. We've got methodological problems, we've got small sample sizes, etc., etc. And their solution is that we need to be looking at big data and machine learning algorithms and that kind of thing, which I'm sure is a really important way to go forward. But we've thought about doing something slightly differently, and coming back to time and complexity that we need to embrace within our research and within developing supports and services for young people who self-harm. We want to keep this complexity. We want to be able to identify all the things that are important to a young person and their self-harm and their psychological distress underpinning that, okay. So we've designed this card sort task for self-harm. We also think it's really important to look at how things evolve over time. We believe that order matters. Why is that? Can anybody read that? Does that make sense to anyone? What if I do that? You read that okay? So this is a lovely quote from John Stuart Mill, who talks about the order of the succession of phenomena being the key thing, the stuff that's really interesting and important. And so we've been thinking about how thoughts, feelings, events and behaviours lead up to self-harm for young people. We use a technique called sequence analysis to analyse the data, but you don't have to analyse the data that we collect using the card sort task in this way. We use sequence analysis because it's really useful to understand patterns of events. It's really useful to understand when events are in the past and you're asking someone to reflect on what's happened to them. It's really useful when you've got complex causal factors and dynamic interplay. So it's being used in a range of settings, mother-child interaction, experience of violence, accidents, sexual assault, and here you can see this is a sequence map from escaping from a burning building. So lots of different ways areas where this kind of technique has been exploited. So we wanted to design a task that could enable us to do this sequential analysis. So we came up with what we call the card sort task for self-harm, or the CATS. And it lets us find out what are the key important sequences that lead to self-harm. What are the cross-dependencies that, unless there was a sequential pattern to the data, we wouldn't see emerging. And we've looked at this for young people and their first ever self-harm episode and their most recent one. So we've got a corpus of 117 cards, which we derive from the risk factor literature, from models of self-harmful and suicidal behaviour, working closely with an advisory group of young people and their experiences, with clinicians and their experiences. And then young people could create their own cards. If there was something missing from their journey, they could simply write it on a card and add it into the corpus. And we asked them to plot on a timeline what were the things that were significant to you that made the difference for you. Across this timeline, going from 6 months before to a week, a day, an hour before self-harm, then after self-harm. We did a simple measurement of mood, how they were feeling before and after the task, to see if it had any impact on how they were feeling. We did a little mood repair task, which our advisory group designed for us, which was a series of cute, funny animals. We wanted to make sure that everybody left the room feeling just as good as they did when they came in. Young people who took part in this task had self-harmed in the past 6 months, and they were aged between 11 and 21 years. Half of them, around half of them, have had experience of living in care with foster parents or in a care home, and the other half hadn't had that experience. So here's an example of a card sort. So you can see sort of 6 months before, then you kind of have this crescendo, lots of cards an hour before to self-harm, and then what happened afterwards. And that's fairly typical, and that crescendo, the hour before, is very much about emotions, as you'll see when I come to talk about what the key patterns are that we uncovered. And here's a close-up so that you can see what was happening 6 months before for this particular person, and then a month before. Okay, so one thing that is sensible to do with sequence analysis is to try and make sense of the data. We do have to narrow down some of the complexity. So we can't keep it all in, but we can zoom in and out to look at things that we eventually have to kind of put into certain bins. So what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides are the things that were really high frequency that had been important to many young people in this study. And here are the top 5 for the first ever episode of self-harm and the most recent episode of self-harm. So number 1 was, again, feeling depressed and sad. Not feeling able to tell anyone how they're feeling, which is clinically really important. It's going to have a massive impact on telling friends, telling family, approaching anyone for help for how you're feeling. We have self-hatred, isolation, and feelings of worthlessness. So really strong negative cognitions and emotions. So these were the top 5. So what we can do is create a big table and examine how often certain cards co-occur together. So we look at what we call the standardized residuals to see which are the ones that are making the real difference to the overall pattern. And they're only making that difference because there is a sequential pattern in the data. So we can see what the key transitions are. So which are the 2-factor transitions that make the strongest contribution in that overall journey, that overall pathway to self-harm? So I'm going to show you a couple of state transition diagrams which map those really key transitions, so we can see What were the things that happened right before self-harm? What were the things that happened longer ago? What were the really important transitions? So the thicker the arrow, the stronger the association, so the higher the standardized normalized residuals. So this is for the first ever episode of self-harm. So the first thing to notice is the only factor that was common in young people that was directly proximal to self-harm was an idea of impulsivity, so doing it without planning. Then proximal to that was having the means to do something, or having access to the means to hurt myself. Then you can see there's a whole group of negative cognitions and emotions that precede self-harm. Again, we've got this significant transition between not being able to tell anyone, which is preceded by just not feeling that you can trust someone enough to tell them how you're feeling. And this was intriguing. For the first ever episode of self-harm, young people are saying, do you know what? Something about this made me feel better. Okay, so that's really important. And I mentioned that we have to bin certain items just to make this a bit more manageable and for us to understand. Also because we do have limited numbers for this analysis. So within here, we've got things grouped together. So there are things like I felt numb, I felt that I didn't belong. Here I've got I accessed information on the internet, but the numbers are too small for us to do anything meaningful with them. So if we have bigger numbers, we could zoom in on those and see what's happening. Again, I think what this is telling us is about the heterogeneity involved, that for some young people, there were other things that mattered. But at the moment, what we're looking at here are the ones that were common to the most young people. Okay, so that was the first ever episode. What about the most recent episode? Okay, so again, impulsivity comes out. I did it on impulse without planning. This time, as well as I had access to means to hurt myself being proximal, we also have a significant transition from self-hatred, okay? We also have the negative cognitions and emotions, but now we have hopelessness creeping in, which was not evident in the first episode of self-harm, and that now transitions to feeling worthless. A very worrying development is now young people are saying, actually, I wanted to die. So this comes in the most recent episode of self-harm. Again, we've got these low and medium frequency items, which interestingly, in both cases, come in the 6 months timestamp, and they're more to do with life events. So there's more heterogeneity about lots of different things that could have started this pathway that are different for different people. And then finally, absolutely crucially, feeling better after self-harm has now disappeared. So by the most recent episode of self-harm, that benefit has gone. This also chimes with some corroborative qualitative data. So young people that took part in this study also did a qualitative interview with us, and they were telling us a number of things in this interview, but one of the key themes that came out when we were asking them about their, what keeps them self-harming, what brought them into self-harming, and what might help them to recover. One of the key things that came out was this idea about not wanting and not being able to talk about self-harm. And I'll just let you read these quotes here, which I think really chime with what we're getting from other parts of the study. So eventually we'll be able to do this quite nice mixed method study. We'll be able to triangulate these results from using different methods across these young people. Okay, so just to show you the kind of impact that taking part in this kind of study had on young people, and this is something that ethics boards are really worried about. Every time we put an ethics application in, we get worries about asking certain questions, And generally what we find and what we see in the literature is actually taking part in research of this nature is more likely to be beneficial than harmful. Okay, so it can be really empowering. So people started off feeling not too bad doing the task, and they ended up feeling not too bad. So there's no significant difference between how they started and how they finished. And these are just examples of some of the little critters that were in our debrief at the end, just in case there were a few people who'd slid down the scale. In the rare cases that had, they had really tough things that they were facing at the time, okay, and that we were able to offer them a direct referral to one of our partners, but it wasn't necessarily to do with taking part in the study. Yeah, someone's got their hand up there.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, on this fast scale, what was the time in between when they did it first?
Yeah. Yeah, so on average, it took people about 20 minutes to do the task. Okay. Okay. Young people really like doing this task. So anecdotally, they were saying, I really liked being able to map out what was happening, and it kind of helped me to understand what's been going on for me. And in a sense, it's a little bit like doing your own case formulation. If you have clinical training, you know, you formulate what the problem might be, and it could be lots of different dimensions. And actually, you know, you can think of how this could be a useful collaborative tool to sit down side by side and work out what are the key things that are happening for a young person at that point. So what can we take from this? We think that complexity and time are really important, and we need to do much more of this. So we're trying in lots of different ways to take this kind of research forward. We see this vortex of negative emotions and cognitions which precede self-harm. Right proximal to self-harm is impulsivity, access to means and self-hatred. More distal in the past are these life events which are also more varied and more heterogeneous. But what we do see, which I think is concerning, is a pattern of deterioration over time. So although there were things that stayed the same, there were certain things that definitely got worse. So feeling better disappeared, wanting to die emerged, as did hopelessness. And interestingly, our results, although they weren't planned to map onto contemporary models of self-harm and suicidal behaviour, they actually do. So you can see that we have these pre-motivational factors in a diathesis stress model, which are kind of further back in the past, which then progress to you know, perhaps ruminative processes, some of the negative emotions and cognitions that we have, and then transitioning to volitional moderators, so going to actually act on self-harmful behaviour. Impulsivity seems to be really important, and access to means. So our data is giving veracity to some of the key models that are being proposed in the literature. But obviously we need to replicate our findings. Okay, so I've already kind of alluded to what some of the practice implications might be for this. I mean, one good news story is that the proximal factors, the key issues, are things that we can do things about. They're modifiable. We know that we can do things about negative thoughts and emotions. We have problem-solving therapy. We have cognitive behavioural therapy. We have dialectical behaviour therapy. Suicidal intent might emerge with repeated self-harm, so it's vital that we regularly assess and monitor and not make assumptions. If a young person presents with self-harm, we cannot assume that this episode right now is the same as the one we saw them for previously, if they have previously self-harmed. We see this rather worrying pattern of deterioration over time. So we could use cats to start those difficult conversations. Placing a card down might be a bit more easy than saying, actually, do you know what, this really awful thing happened to me? And you might not want to say that. And you might place a card down and say, I'm putting this card down, but I don't want to talk about it yet. But I want you to know that that card is in this space for me. So it could help us focus therapy. What's important now, what might become useful down the line. Obviously, it might be useful to assess and map changes over time. Now, this one is entirely our young people. So our most recent meeting with our advisory group, they want to use this as an intervention. So we've already got it online. So we're testing out an online version versus a paper version just to see how that's going. But what they would like is it to be in an app, so they can use it on a daily basis to see what's changing, what's staying the same, and so on. Now, I probably would have got here in about 10 to 15 years, carefully jiggering away as an academic. But I have an advisory group of young people saying, you need to do this as an intervention now. So no pressure. Okay, so what does help? I'm going to spend the last bit of the lecture just talking about the literature on what we know in terms of interventions that have been established and trialled in randomized controlled trials might be useful. So you need to imagine sort of Star Wars type music, probably not, yeah. So this will tell you just how very old I am, because I started doing this 20 years ago with these lovely people. This is Keith Horton, who's one of the leading lights of self-harm and suicidal research, and Ella Arensman, who is now the first female president of the International Association of Suicide Prevention. And Keith, to this day, still gets us mixed up. So if we're standing side by side, I could be Ella or Ellen. You just never can tell. So when we started this work 20 years ago, we found 20 trials. We did a systematic review, and we found 20 trials. And it looked at that time like psychological therapies, problem-solving therapies were promising. What's the picture now? Well, we have split the review into 3 Cochrane systematic reviews, which is good because it means there's a lot more data. There are many more randomized controlled trials now. So we have 73 trials completed. We've got 7 trials that have looked at pharmacological interventions for self-harm in adults. The short story of that systematic review is the drugs don't work. Psychosocial interventions for self-harm in adults I'll say a tiny bit about, but I'm going to mainly focus on interventions for self-harming in children and adolescents, which, given the scale of the problem and that huge peak that you saw at the start, 11 trials worldwide. I get cross about this, as you can tell. So the adult evidence base is really strengthening. We have 55 studies, and the kind of take-home message from this systematic review is that talking treatments might help people who self-harm. So that's cognitive behavioural therapy, dialectical behaviour therapy, and problem-solving therapy. Now, in a systematic review, you gather together all the available evidence, you synthesize it in hopefully sensible ways, and you do an analysis of the quality and the biases to ensure that it's the intervention that's making the difference here and not some kind of random error or noise in the quality of the RCT. So for the young person systematic review, and I believe these are available to download on the Cochrane, but I would do so with caution because they're extremely long documents and they do give rather a headache, but there are nice summaries to dip into. So I always tell my students, dip in and dip out again and dip in. So our review questions were these. Are interventions of self-harm effective in reducing repetition? That's our primary outcome, reducing the number of people who repeat self-harm. Also, we're looking at secondary outcomes, so we want to see the frequency of self-harm reducing. We want to see reductions in suicide ideation, depression and hopelessness, and we want to see improvements in problem solving. So we searched the literature for RCTs of psychosocial interventions, which were compared against treatment as usual, so what you might get in kind of typical clinical practice, or enhanced usual care, which is similar. To be entered into trials, people had to have self-harmed within the past 6 months. So young people here up to the age of 18 and including 18. We searched 5 electronic databases, and we pestered people for unpublished data, and we did the risk of bias analysis. So I think first thing to say is there are lots of different types of intervention, which I think speaks again to this sort of multidimensional heterogeneity of self-harm. So we have green card studies which allow a young person to have access to psychiatric services in times of crisis. We have family therapy, we have group-based psychotherapy, try and boost psychosocial interactions, cognitive behaviour therapy to challenge maladaptive thoughts and beliefs, adherence enhancements, following up with meetings at home, telephone calls to try and get people embedded into therapy more readily. Dialectical behaviour therapy, which is a mix of life skills training. It has some cognitive elements. There's a big mindfulness element to dialectical behaviour therapy to try to get clients to regulate their emotions and to tolerate emotions more readily. Therapeutic assessment is really doing a very thorough assessment with a young person collaboratively, then following up with a letter of understanding about where we've agreed therapy should go. And then finally, mentalization-based therapy, which has roots in attachment theory and is to do with understanding, increasing the understanding of the mental states of both the person and other people, so that the young person can start to understand the impact of their behaviour on other people and to develop empathy. So here's a really horrible diagram. You don't have to worry about it too much. It's called a forest plot. I like to call them blobograms. So what we've got here are data from dialectical behaviour therapy showing us a repetition of self-harm at follow-up, post-treatment, so straight after treatment's finished. And what we'd really like to see is all these blobs this side of the line with none of the confidence intervals crossing over the line of no effect. So that would tell us that we're seeing a positive effect for the experimental new treatment compared to treatment as usual. So the first thing to notice is that DBT does not reduce the number of young people repeating self-harm. But we have some rather more encouraging data for mentalization-based therapy. This is only in one trial, though, and it's a very small trial. So we have some interesting evidence here that mentalization-based therapy does, in fact, reduce the number of young people repeating self-harm. But that's in one single trial, and it's a small trial. No other intervention that I've talked about demonstrated a significant reduction in repetition. What about group-based therapy? So we have 3 trials that looked at group-based therapy. The first one, which was conducted in the UK, very promising. You can see nice effect to favouring group-based psychotherapy. 2 subsequent trials, one creeping in the wrong direction and one definitely going in completely the wrong direction. So cumulatively, when we aggregate the data together in a meta-analysis, we see that our blob here, our effect size, our odds ratio, is going in the right direction, but it's not significant. So group-based psychotherapy does not reduce the number of young people repeating self-harm. Dialectical behaviour therapy, we looked at in particular in relation to frequency of self-harm post-intervention. And again, you can see we've got no evidence here that DBT reduces the frequency of self-harm. Secondary outcomes, there was a little bit of evidence in improving psychological distress. So what can we say about this review? Very few studies, 11 studies worldwide. We don't have sufficient evidence for group-based therapy or DBT. However, we've got significant issues with these trials being underpowered. We simply don't have enough people in these trials. If we were to see what looked like sort of tantalizingly significant clinical effect, it's not going to come out statistically. I think one of the big problems in our field is that we have not involved people with lived experience in developing trials. This goes for adult literature as well. But in particular, young people have not been involved in designing these trials, which I think is something that we need to improve on. So how can you do that? A couple of examples. I've already talked about our Listen Up project. And that was interesting because we had young people all the way through the research process with us, right to dissemination, and they made some films with us, which if you go on our website, you can see some of the films, young people reflecting on our findings from their own personal experience. And remember, they helped shape these priorities. And they also did things like, they designed our materials for us so that they'd be really appealing to young people, that young people would want to pick them up and look at them in a waiting room, and they had meaning and so on. A more recent development is Cafe Connect, which is where we meet young people in the community. So I work at the University of Nottingham, which is beautiful, but it has an ivory tower and it has barriers. So it's not very welcoming. So we've been going into the community in what we call Cafe Connect. So here you can see one of the first Cafe Connects that we did. So people here are taking part in a range of research throughout the research life cycle. So some people are doing focus groups, some people are taking part in actual data collection, and some people were hearing about the results of findings of research, but in the community, in a relaxed, welcoming environment. What do young people find helpful? Not clinical services. Don't shoot the messenger if you're a clinician. Boyfriends and girlfriends. So if they're the ones that are doing the support, they need support in the community, psychoeducation, support for young people. Grandparents. Interestingly, our last Cafe Connect event, we had 4 grandparents come specifically to speak to us about a grandchild that they were concerned about. And we could sit down and have a cup of coffee with them and just talk about that in the cafe. The bottom 10 are all clinical services. The things that young people do not find helpful are all clinical services. And I think particularly worrying is harm minimisation. We have no evidence, RCT evidence, on whether this works or not. So this is self-harming in a safer way or using less risky means. We have some qualitative corroborative data for this as well, which I normally say in the UK, CAMS clinical services are Marmite, which I don't think quite translates here. So Marmite is a bit like Vegemite, but it's much stronger. You either love it or you hate it. And CAMS is a bit like that in the UK. So we have some information from young people, and they say, CAMS workers, clinical people working in adolescent settings can be really patronising. But it's not all bad. And, there are some absolutely amazing clinicians who are prepared to do what it takes to help a young person to recover. And if it means just sitting quietly with a young person, that's what they'll do. Okay, last couple of slides. So I'm afraid clinical services for young people need a big revamp. We have to involve young people in this process. We need to think about where these services are located. And I think the community is probably a better place for them than in statutory services. We desperately need more trials. That's a kind of boring conclusion from systematic reviews, but it's a really important one in this case, I think. We're really excited about the CATS task. We're going to do it online. We'll work towards it being an intervention carefully, and so on. So my take-home messages for you tonight are these. First, we need to embrace time and complexity. Self-harm evolves over time, and we make assumptions about self-harm at our peril and at the peril of the young people that we are supporting. We need more trials. We have to involve young people. Listening is something that comes up time and again in research on young people who self-harm. They do not feel listened to. Taking a compassionate stance when someone is in distress, recognizing that distress and making a commitment to make a difference for young people could be a really powerful thing to do. We could all do that. Having said that, if you are supporting someone who's self-harming or is suicidal, it's really important that you look after yourself. Okay? I always think of, we put seat belts on when we drive, and the message that we get when we get on a plane is when the airbag comes down, you have to do your own first, and then you look after someone else. So if you are supporting someone who self-harms or is suicidal, it's really important to look after yourself. That's just to say thank you to all the amazing people that I collaborate with and work with, and of course our funders. And I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. That was fantastic. So we've gone slightly over time, but I can gauge that there's considerable enthusiasm in the room, so we might just take a few questions. I'm going to send Matt or Nick round with the microphone. Questions for Ellen?
Back there.
Is it on? Okay. I was just wondering, in terms of finding younger people online, are there movements towards social media such as Tumblr and trying to dig people out that way?
Yeah, and in fact, a number of my PhD students have gone to that kind of mode of collecting data, and it's a particularly powerful way to get young men engaged. So we see our gender ratios getting much better when we do stuff online and recruit people from exactly those sorts of sites. Yeah.
Yeah, I've certainly seen myself. There are certain fandoms where it is, if you've done suicide awareness training or you've learnt to spot self-harm, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Just how many people are expressing suicidal thoughts or saying they're self-harming. So I guess it's, yeah. Does it seem as though there's any pathways yet to channel people into?
How do you mean channel them?
So is there current studies that are recruiting, do you know?
Yes, and in fact there's a big, look at Joe, who's setting up a really massive project on social media through the Origin Centre. So if you kind of keep looking at their website, I'm sure there'll be amazing updates about the really important work they're doing in that field.
Thank you so much.
That's okay.
I don't need a microphone. Thank you very much. That was most informing. Also, what about working with people who may have previously been self-harmers? Can you share any
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, so people who've recovered.
Yeah.
Well, that was a really interesting point because Harmless, who was the organisation who got into the top 10 useful things that young people found, are actually a user-led support service based in the community. So they're people who have lived experience, who have recovered, who are trained psychotherapists. So, you know, they're fantastic partners for a number of reasons. I mean, in terms of the literature, there's some of that, but not a lot from my knowledge. So that's probably an area of, you know, future development, really.
Statistically, what's any idea of percentages of people who do recover?
Not so easy to determine as, you know, the more negative outcomes. So, for example, we know that having presented for self-harm to an emergency department, so 1 in 25 will have died in the next 5 years. But, you know, recovery is possible and it happens all the time. And I think we need a lot more data on that. I think it was some at the back.
Okay. We might take 2 more questions.
Right. Thank you. Well, thank you for the talk. Now, this is at the wrong end of the discussion because this relates to a young person that I work with who succeeded.
Yeah.
Committed, died through misadventure. I went to his funeral and I noticed his drug and alcohol worker wasn't there. So I went back to the youth centre and I approached a drug and alcohol worker and I said, I noticed you weren't at the funeral, why weren't you there? He said he made the conscious decision not to go to the funeral because if he was going to a funeral, he'd be going to a funeral every 2 weeks. And he made that comment 20 years ago when I first started working with young people at risk, and it's stayed with me ever since. What work is being done? Again, this is at the wrong end. You're trying to do the early intervention or the pre-intervention. What work is being done with the workers to keep those workers in the field and use those experiences to prevent future incidents or attempts?
Nothing in a hugely strategic, thought-out way, certainly in the UK. Training and support is done in a kind of piecemeal way. It's often done by third sector organisations like Harmless that I was talking about. And I think you raise a really important point about you know, and I think it sort of speaks to the point I made at the end about looking after yourself if you're working in this field, because it is, you know, it can be really challenging. And I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if you've heard about the Zero Suicide campaign, which is about creating suicide-safe communities so that we think about suicide prevention in all aspects of life, not just in kind of clinical environments. So we think about whether our work environments are suicide safe. I mean, where would your organisation be on a scale of kind of suicide safeness and awareness? And I think we have a big challenge still with stigma around these issues. That people don't want to talk about them, they're frightened to talk about them, and they're certainly, you know, they're not necessarily having conversations on a daily basis about these issues. So I think we have a body of work to do to raise awareness and to support people that are working in the field.
One final question. Hand up over here. down here, Matt, I think.
Just wait, because people won't be able to hear you. Here comes Matt, striding with the mic.
I'd just like to ask, what will be considered as a full recovery from self-harm?
What a good question. What a good question. Now, recovery can mean different things to different people. So we're lucky enough to have a guy called Mike Slade at Nottingham. His entire research programme is about recovery, and there are individual differences. So for one person, it might be that they don't self-harm very often, or they self-harm, you know, very infrequently. For another person, it might be, you know, I just don't do it anymore. I think I want to reiterate the psychological distress which underpins. It's a physical manifestation of psychological pain. And what we need to be dealing with is that psychological pain, whatever that means for the individual.